If you are at or near retirement, you may find yourself familiar with the 4% rule. And since the early 1990s, the 4% rule has been considered by many to be the gold standard of retirement income planning. Many financial advisors will default to this. Many retirees who are collecting income will also default to this. Many financial calculators that you may see on the internet are also centered around the 4% rule. The 4% rule was first discovered back in the 1990s by financial planner Bill Bengen, and he focused quite a bit on research and determining what the worst case scenario would have been in any market environment since 1926, and then constructing an income and a portfolio that would withstand the worst scenario. Based on what he was able to find, the 4% rule came into existence. Basically, that you could take out 4% of your beginning portfolio, adjust it each year for inflation, and you, as a retiree, would not run out of money. But in recent months, Bill Bengen has found himself back on the circuit, and he's had some adjustments to what he originally coined the 4% rule. We're going to tackle this today. If we've not yet met, my name is Danny Cieniewicz. I'm a CFP professional from Hyperion Financial. I think what's important is to start where Bill Bengen was starting. He was trying to find the best way in which retirees could take a lump sum balance and then safely withdraw it over the course of their lifetime. He was focusing perhaps more on safety than utility or enjoyment, but there's probably a good reason for that. He wanted to make sure that retirees were avoiding the number one fear that most people have, which is running out of money in retirement. That being said, finding that balance of too conservative and too risky is also something that I think Bill Bengen has come back around to. And to be fair to Bill Bengen, before you jump on him and say the 4% rule is bunk or it's not the right thing that people should be doing, plenty of folks have had successful retirements based off this rule. They've been able to enjoy their retirements based on the 4% rule. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for doing the research into this. I also think one of the other things that he wasn't quite anticipating was how widespread this would become, and by many retirees and financial planners, really accepted as dogma. Instead, he came up with research, shared his findings, and it pretty much took off like wildfire. That being said, as I mentioned in the outset of the video, he's been making his rounds, and as a result, a couple of things have kind of come to the light. Specifically in his research and some of the new findings that he's had as he's been tailoring some of his research over the last 30 years. What Bengen had discovered was that in October of 1968, if a retiree had retired at this time, they were about to experience one of the worst market returns and retirements when it came time to market returns in the last 100 years or so. Being that this is the case, what Bengen's research discovered was if he took 4.15% and adjusted for inflation each and every single year from his portfolio, he would have still had what would be deemed a quote-unquote successful retirement. In other words, not running out of money. Now, to be very clear, this is also being very simplistic and not taking into account the many nuances that retirees face when it comes down to portfolio withdrawals in retirement. Another one of his key assumptions was that he really only used two asset classes, and it was split in a 50-50 portfolio between U.S. large cap stocks and U.S. 5-year bonds. These two asset classes are what his research was based on, rather than introducing other asset classes, which could have a more positive or negative effect depending on the market returns that they would result. In time, Bengen has added up to 7 asset classes, including U.S. small cap stocks, mid cap stocks, in addition to the large cap stocks. By adding these additional asset classes, he now has been able to tweak some of his answers, including some of the recent returns we've had as well. Being that he's been able to make some of these adjustments, the 4% founder himself has now ratcheted up the amount that he feels that a retiree could safely withdraw. As a result, the 4% rule may be a bit outdated. Instead, it could be coined the 4.7% rule, or even higher in some cases. As Bengen even says himself in an interview, he believes it could be the 5% rule. Now, there are 2 conditions that Bengen wants to make sure that's disclosed, and I'll cover those in just a minute. But the significance of going from 4% to 5% on an annual withdrawal rate is no joke. You may be thinking to yourself, well, 1%, what difference does that make? Well, let's do the math. If you have $1 million saved in a retirement account and you're planning to utilize the 4% rule, you're starting out at $40,000. You're adjusting for inflation over the course of your retirement. If you use a 5% withdrawal rate, that's a $10,000 a year difference. Think about the difference that could be made. $10,000 a year is no joke. As a result of bumping from 4 to 5%, You could instead be focusing on making memories and enjoying retirement more than you would if you were just living on the 4%. Now, this could also be the case where if you saved up funds in your retirement, but instead want to retire early or maybe earlier than you initially anticipated, 5% can stretch further than 4%. Now, you may be wondering, well, what is the unsuccessful times or how does that work? Typically, there is some luck that's involved with this. And we recently shot a video on sequence of returns risk. And depending on when you retired and how much you were taking out, that could have an effect. So if you have two bear markets that take place pretty close together, one of them potentially being in 1968, another one being in the year 2000, you could find yourself in a retirement that isn't quite as enjoyable and it's completely outside your control. But all of that aside, that still leaves retirement in place and potentially utilizing the 4% rule that could be had. But instead of those unlucky few that retire in the worst possible times, we also have many retirees which could have retired on a higher withdrawal rate and some even higher than 5%. Much of it does depend on luck. So we cannot predict that. And we're not going to get in the business of predicting that. But you can also do a couple of things that might work to your favor. And going back to those conditions that Bengen talked about, there are two things that retirees must do if you want to focus on the 5% rule as opposed to the 4% rule. Instead of focusing on the two different asset classes that Bengen had originally talked through, which was US large caps and 5-year US bonds, it's important to instead embrace diversification. And if you're watching this in the year 2025, this should come as no surprise to you. For example, international stocks have had one of the better years in recent memories. That hasn't been the case over the past several years, where US stocks have outperformed international stocks. But in this year, when international stocks are outperforming US stocks, diversification is certainly helping the cause. That being said, we still don't know what the future holds. But based on prior research, we can determine that retirees can take out 5% and still have successful retirements. One of the other things, though, that's important to keep in mind, and something that we've talked about in previous videos as well, is the ability to be more flexible with your withdrawals. And what we mean by that is in cases of sudden market downturns, making sure that you're able to utilize these funds in a discretionary manner. So while you may take out 5% over the long term, perhaps you scale back some of the withdrawals when the market is not behaving accordingly. To put this into retiree terms, when the market takes a sudden correction, a 20% drop, perhaps you delay that European vacation that you were planning or the kitchen remodel that you wanted to have. These are some things that you might be able to do so on a discretionary basis. But what makes this actually work is that if you're utilizing the 5% rule in more discretionary terms, this is where the 5% rule could really come in handy. Because if Social Security and other guaranteed income sources are covering your base expenses, the fixed expenses that won't change, discretionary expenses can be covered by the 5% withdrawals. And if that's the case and you can scale back on some of those discretionary expenses, you can give your account, specifically the stock funds, a chance to recover when the market's taking a beating. Candidly, this is where art, science, and psychology can all come in together. The finances themselves, it's important to make sure that you have a grasp on how they work. Specifically, how rates of returns will work in retirement, how taxes work in retirement, how inflation works in retirement. These things, while they may be out of your control to some degree, are also going to vary, and you can be reactionary to them, maximizing your efficiency. But there's also an art to this. How do you handle the emotion of a 20% drop? If you would have retired in the year 2000 and had 3 successive drops in a row in the S&P 500, would you be back working? What would you have done in 2008? These are all types of scenarios that can take place, and as we're seeing in present times, volatility isn't going anywhere. Instead, what retirees can focus on is what's the worst case scenario and are you equipped to handle that? There are also retirees who may not need 5% from their portfolio. And if you're in that position, good for you. You're probably in a position where you won't run out of money, assuming that the market does return well, you don't make any drastically bad decisions. But it's also the case where if you're looking to get max utility out of your retirement account, using a 5% withdrawal rate as opposed to a 4% withdrawal rate can find the proper balance of maximizing still a conservative approach, but also getting the type of enjoyment and happiness that you're searching for by taking this withdrawal. The problem in all of this, though, is that there's no guarantee that can take place in withdrawal rates. You may be able to withdraw 4.5% to 5% and be okay in most market scenarios, but we also don't know what the future holds. As I mentioned, A couple of bear markets in a short period of time can usually do people in retirement. It's something that if you're not prepared or equipped to handle, or you don't have a contingency in place, it could drastically affect how you're able to retire. And more importantly, it can make you very emotional and in some cases depressed in retirement if your finances aren't matched up. To best handle this, I think there are four things that need to be present and that you're accounting for when it comes to your retirement. One is likely going to be outside of your control, while the other three are within your control. The first one is evaluating how market conditions are taking place. There are going to be situations where there are sudden market drops, slower market drops, sudden market jumps, and slower market jumps. In each of these scenarios, it's important to make sure that you're monitoring how the market is generally doing. I don't think that means that you should be watching this every single day, but you should have an idea on how your accounts are performing, especially if you're planning to withdraw from these accounts. You may not have as much control over the market in retirement, so that's something you just want to be aware of as opposed to trying to control. There are some things that are within your control, however. The first one is your spending flexibility. As I mentioned a couple moments ago, if you're using these funds in a more discretionary manner, then you can always turn off, turn up, turn down, or ratchet up some of the withdrawals in which you're taking. In that case, in times when the markets are really doing well, you might be able to take out more in a given year. In years where the markets experience a downturn, whether it's sudden over the course of a slower market downturn, it's probably a good idea to scale back some of your discretionary funding if you're looking to make sure that you're preserving this for the long term. It's also important to make sure that you're getting portfolio diversification. As we mentioned before, Bengen's original 4% rule really only had two asset classes in it. When he accounts for more asset classes, he's able to withdraw a higher percentage and still keep a more conservative end result. This is all the more important, again, as we look at some of the factors that have taken place in the past several years. By getting exposure over the course of different market sectors, you're able to make sure that you can capture more winners and losers rather than just capturing or putting your eggs in one particular asset class. And something that I think is more important than anything is regular monitoring. Again, following how your spending is going or following if you're doing well in the market or following the diversification that you have is certainly a good idea because what you set up in the first year of retirement may change drastically over the second, third, fourth, and 20th year of retirement. If you instead work with professionals such as my team and I at Hyperion Financial, you can instead stop worrying about the market each and every single day and worry about your retirement and the things that you're looking to enjoy. Now, we have quite a bit talked about the 4% rule in prior videos, the 5% rule. We talk about Social Security. We talk about nearly everything when it comes to retirement planning on this channel. So if you haven't yet subscribed, be sure you do so. But what I also want to caution against is that you don't just necessarily take the information from this video and apply it to your situation without first determining what your retirement looks like. I think retirement is a great example for you to kind of recreate your life in a way. You go from working and having 40 hours a week or possibly more, maybe a little bit less, of your time that's dedicated to a job. By switching to retirement, you are taking a pretty significant life change. Making sure that your retirement is tailored to you is the best decision that you can make. And I think there's one common number that retirees do need to make sure that they're accounting for. And if you'd like to know what that number is, I recommend you check this video out right